On the 18th of August, 1976, a small work crew walked into the most heavily guarded strip of land on Earth carrying saws and axes. Their job was to trim the branches of a single poplar tree. 90 seconds after the first branch fell, 2 American officers were dying on the pavement, and within 72 hours the United States would fly nuclear-capable bombers to the Korean border to finish cutting that tree down. The Joint Security Area at Panmunjom is not really a border. It is a shared room, an argument that never ended. When the Korean War stopped in 1953, it stopped without a peace treaty. What replaced peace was a ceasefire line, a village of blue huts, and 2 armies standing close enough to read each other's faces. Inside that shared space, soldiers from both sides walked the same ground. There were no walls. There were rules, and there were provocations. And for 23 years, the 2 sides had tested each other with everything short of a war they both knew they could not afford to restart. To understand why a tree mattered, you have to understand what 1976 felt like on that line. The ceasefire had already survived something close to 1,000 recorded incidents. In '68, North Korean commandos had crossed the border to try to kill the South Korean president, and a North Korean patrol boat had seized an American spy ship and held its crew for 11 months. In '74, South Korean engineers had found the first of several invasion tunnels dug under the mountains. Nobody on either side treated the line as settled. By the summer of 1976, one of those tests had become a tree. The tree stood near a bridge the soldiers called the Bridge of No Return. It was a Normandy poplar, roughly 100 feet tall, and every summer it did the same infuriating thing. It grew leaves. Those leaves mattered because of geometry. A United Nations command checkpoint sat at one end of a line of sight. An observation post sat at the other. Between them, the poplar's canopy blocked the view. For most of the year, that was a nuisance. In August, with the tree at full leaf, the checkpoint effectively went blind. A blind checkpoint in the Joint Security Area was not a small problem. That checkpoint was isolated, surrounded on 3 sides by North Korean positions, and the observation post was the only thing that could see it. If something happened to the men inside, nobody would know until it was over. There were rules for the Joint Security Area, and both sides mostly kept them. Each side could keep about 35 men inside at a time. No automatic weapons. Pistols and clubs were tolerated. Rifles were not. The rules existed because everyone understood the arithmetic. This was the one place on Earth where a single angry sergeant could start a war between nuclear-armed alliances in under a minute. So the United Nations Command decided to trim the branches. Not cut the tree down. Trim it. The request went through channels, and on the 18th of August a crew was assigned. This was also not the first attempt. A crew had gone out to deal with the same tree earlier, and North Korean guards had objected then too, and the work had been quietly dropped. That is the detail that makes the 18th of August hard to read as a misunderstanding. Both sides already knew this tree was a fight waiting to happen. The crew was 5 South Korean workers with axes. Their escort was small on purpose. Captain Arthur Boniface, First Lieutenant Mark Barrett, a South Korean officer, and a handful of enlisted men. Boniface had 3 days left in Korea. His replacement had already arrived and had been introduced to the job. Boniface could have handed the detail over and stayed behind that morning. He went out with the crew instead, which is the kind of decision that reads as completely ordinary right up until the moment it doesn't. He was 33 years old, and he was going home to his wife and 3 children. They started work around 10:40 in the morning. Within minutes, North Korean guards appeared and watched. That was normal. What happened next was not. A North Korean officer arrived. The Americans knew him. Lieutenant Pack Chul had been at the joint security area long enough to earn a nickname from the men who watched him work. They called him Bulldog. He had a reputation for pushing right up to the line and then a little past it. For about 15 minutes, Pack watched the crew work. Then he told them to stop. The branches, he said, must not be cut. Boniface told the crew to keep working. It was a United Nations command tree on United Nations command ground, and the work had been cleared. Pack sent a runner. A truck arrived and unloaded about 20 more North Korean soldiers. Some carried crowbars and clubs. Now, the numbers in that clearing were roughly 30 against 11, and the 11 were holding gardening tools. Then Pack did something the men watching from the observation post would remember for the rest of their lives. He took off his wristwatch, wrapped it carefully in a handkerchief, and put it in his pocket. It was the gesture of a man who did not want his watch broken in what came next. The attack took less than half a minute. The North Korean soldiers went for the officers first, and they used the crew's own axes dropped where the workers had been standing. Captain Boniface went down under repeated blows and never got up. Lieutenant Barrett was chased into a hollow beside the road. The whole thing was photographed. Men at the observation post were taking pictures when it started, and they kept taking them. That is the reason this event is not a disputed story. The record exists frame by frame, and it is the reason the response could not be quiet. Boniface was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. Barrett died of his injuries later that day. 9 other men were wounded, and the tree, the actual reason all of this had started, still stood there with most of its branches on. In Washington, the question was not whether to respond. It was how to respond to a killing at a ceasefire line without starting the war that the ceasefire had been holding back for 23 years. The answer they chose was almost absurd in its simplicity. They would go back and cut down the tree, all of it, and they would bring enough force that interfering with the work would mean starting a war on purpose. They called it Operation Paul Bunyan, after the American folk giant who felled forests with an axe. On the 21st of August, a convoy entered the joint security area. 23 vehicles, 16 of them engineer trucks carrying chainsaws. The ground force had a name, Task Force Vieira, after the lieutenant colonel who commanded the security battalion. 2 30-man security platoons went in on foot. A company of infantry waited in helicopters overhead, close enough to land inside the joint security area in seconds. Every man had a specific job, and none of those jobs was to cut the tree. The tree was the engineer's problem. Everyone else was there to make sure the engineers were left alone. 813 men went in on the ground. 64 of them were South Korean special forces who had, reportedly, left their rifles behind and brought martial arts training instead, on the theory that unarmed men could not be accused of firing first. Above them, the sky filled up. 27 helicopters, attack aircraft circling, a flight of F-4 Phantoms, B-52 bombers flown from Guam, deliberately visible on North Korean radar, escorted so there could be no mistake about what they were. Offshore, the aircraft carrier Midway and her battle group. On the ground beyond the fence line, 12,000 additional troops moved to alert. Artillery was ranged. Surface-to-air missile crews stood ready. Every one of those pieces existed to protect a work detail with chainsaws. The convoy drove in. The engineers started their saws. North Korean soldiers gathered and watched, and about 150 of them took up positions nearby with machine guns. Nobody fired. The tree came down in 42 minutes. The convoy left the stump standing about 20 feet tall and drove out. There's a detail in the planning that says everything about how carefully this was calculated. The force was built to be overwhelming and simultaneously to be unable to start the war by accident. The men closest to the North Koreans were the least armed. The heaviest weapons were the furthest away, where nervous trigger finger could not reach. It was a demonstration engineered so that the only way it turned into a war was if the other side chose that deliberately. Later that day, something happened that had never happened before. A message came across from the North Korean side expressing regret over the incident. Not an apology in the full sense, and it was read very differently on each side of the line. But in 23 years of shouting across that table, it was the closest thing to a step backward that anyone had seen. Both sides then quietly agreed to something they should have agreed to decades earlier. They divided the joint security area with a line and stopped walking freely through each other's space. The shared room was finally split in two. The checkpoint that started all of this was named for Captain Boniface. The stump was left where it was, and years later a monument was set beside it. It is worth sitting with the scale of what was spent here. 2 officers were killed with hand tools in a clearing, and the response involved bombers launched from an island 2,500 miles away. A carrier battle group repositioned, and 12,000 men moved to alert, also that a work crew could finish a piece of gardening. That was the point. The tree was never the objective. The objective was to prove that the line could not be pushed, and the only way to prove it was to go back and do the exact thing that had gotten 2 men killed. 2 men died over the branches of a poplar tree. Then the most powerful military on Earth flew bombers halfway across the Pacific to prove it could finish trimming it. The ceasefire held. It is still holding, and it is still only a ceasefire.